The housekeeper could hardly believe that on that day she had no choice but to bring her son to the mansion. Among so many endless rooms and corridors, a single moment of carelessness was enough for the child to disappear before her eyes. Her heart raced, and every minute of searching felt like an eternity. Breathless, she ran to the backyard and then froze. The millionaire boss, famous for his arrogance, was standing before the child. But the unexpected gesture he made left her completely shaken. The first scream isn't of pain, but of surprise. In the backyard, bathed in the golden afternoon light, the boss, the most arrogant man in the gated community, is smiling as he pushes the swing where the housekeeper's son laughs, his little boots kicking in the air. Lucia freezes at the sliding glass door, her yellow rubber gloves still damp, the smell of disinfectant competing with the expensive cologne wafting from the study. The world, which until then had been made of cold orders and do it right, suddenly cracks open. Behind the impeccable suit is someone who knows how to play. But nothing, absolutely nothing, will be simple after this moment. That instant, frozen in time, was the result of a morning that had begun long before sunrise in the frenetic pace of New York City. At 4:30, the alarm blared in her small Queens apartment, and Lucia was already on her feet, brewing coffee in the chipped enamel mug she'd inherited from her grandmother. The strong aroma helped her wake up as she gazed out the kitchen window at the neighboring building's fire escape, where clothes hanging out to dry looked like ghosts dancing in the cold pre-dawn breeze. Her son, Leo, 5 years old, slept soundly in the next room, clutching a stuffed tiger that was missing one of its button eyes. Routine was her fortress: wake up, make coffee, pack a lunch, and drop Leo at her mother's before catching the first packed commuter train to the wealthy Connecticut suburb, where life seemed to be made of a different material, something lighter and shinier. But on that day, the fortress crumbled. The call from her mother, Elvira, came with a voice choked with pain. "Honey, my back's thrown out so bad I can't even sit up." Panic rose in Lucia's throat. Plan B, her neighbor Cindy, also fell through. Her grandson had been up all night with a fever. There was no plan C. The money she earned at that mansion was sacred. The rent wouldn't wait. The electric bill had a due date. Taking Leo with her was the only desperate option. Their arrival at the Greenwich estate was rushed by the chaos of a street fair set up nearby, trucks honking, the smell of roasted corn in the air, and people jaywalking without a care. Hand in hand with the boy, Lucia entered through the service gate, her heart tight in her chest. The house manager, Beatrice, a woman with a rigid posture and a gaze that measured the world from above, greeted her with lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. "Lucia, you know the rules. Children are not permitted during work hours." Her voice was polished but sharp as glass. Lucia shrank, apologizing, swearing the boy wouldn't make a sound. She left Leo sitting in a discreet corner of the pantry with a coloring book and crayons, pleading with her eyes for him to stay there, invisible. For hours, Lucia worked with double the efficiency, her muscles tense, her mind split between the gleam of the marble floors and her worry for her son. The house was a monumental, echoing silence, broken only by the distant sound of her boss, Mr. Sterling, dictating orders over the phone in his study. A man whose fortune was as vast as his temper was unpredictable. She cleaned the traces of a life she didn't understand, a life of deals, of capital that multiplied somewhere far away. As she finished cleaning the main living room, her heart leaped. Leo was no longer in the pantry corner. A cold terror washed over her as she searched for him, silently, room by room. That's when she heard it. Coming from the garden, the gentle creak of chains from the swing hanging from an old oak tree, and a child's laugh she knew like her own soul. And as she reached the glass door, the scene that made her hold her breath hit her full force. Mr. Sterling, the man who barely glanced her way, was there, his expensive suit jacket unbuttoned, pushing the swing with a gentleness she would have never imagined. On his face, a genuine smile, and in Leo's eyes, the pure joy of a child. That gesture, so simple and so impossible, opened an abyss beneath Lucia's feet. She didn't know if she felt relief or an even greater fear. Time seemed to stretch and contract, turning the sun-drenched backyard into a still painting. Lucia felt the air leave her lungs, her heart beating erratically against her ribs, a drum of silent panic. Each of Leo's laughs was both a relief and a stab of terror. That man, Mr. Sterling, was an island of power and distance, a universe of wealth built on rules she hardly dared to decipher. To see him there, his expensive shoes on the grass and the hands that signed multi-million-dollar contracts pushing her son's swing, was a breach of protocol so profound that Lucia didn't know how to react. Her feet were rooted to the spot. To move felt like a betrayal of the established order, a risk that could cost her everything. Finally, he saw her. The smile on his face didn't vanish immediately, but it flickered like a candle flame in a draught. He slowed the swing to a gentle stop and straightened up, the suit once again looking like armor. "Lucia," he said, and the neutral, almost cold tone snapped the world back onto its axis. "I found your little explorer by the fountain." His voice was calm, but Lucia felt an implicit reprimand, a reminder that this was not her son's place. "I'm sorry, sir." "1,000 apologies." He wandered off, she stammered, hurrying into the garden. The smell of freshly cut grass mingled with her nervousness. "Leo, come with Mommy now." The boy, however, looked from his boss's face to his mother's, confused by the sudden shift in atmosphere. Before she could reach him, the figure of Beatrice appeared at her side, silent as a shadow. "What did I tell you about keeping the child in the pantry?" the house manager hissed, her voice low but laced with venom. "This is an unacceptable lack of respect. Mr. Sterling has important business, assets to protect. He cannot be disturbed." The attack was aimed at Lucia, but Beatrice's eyes shot daggers at her boss, as if accusing him of allowing this familiarity. To the surprise of both women, Mr. Sterling raised a hand. "Beatrice, it's all right. I was the one who brought him out here." The boy was no bother at all. The unexpected defense left the house manager speechless, her face hardening into a mask of restrained resentment. At that moment, another presence joined them. Mr. Davies, the company lawyer, a man with narrow shoulders and a calculating gaze, appeared at the glass door, holding a briefcase. His eyes scanned the scene. The boss with his tie slightly loosened, the housekeeper in her damp uniform, the boy with flushed cheeks. A crease of concern formed on his forehead. He said nothing, but his silence was an accusation, a visual audit of the risks to his client's image and assets. Lucia finally grabbed Leo's hand, pulling him with an urgency that startled him. "Let's go, honey, now." As she turned away, bowing in a silent apology, Mr. Sterling's voice reached her again. "See you later, Leo." The name, he said the name. Lucia paused for a fraction of a second. How did he know? She had never said her son's name aloud in his presence. A chill ran down her spine as she hurried inside, her face burning with shame and confusion. It was only as she was gathering her things, her heart still pounding, that a memory struck her. That morning, on the train, so she wouldn't forget, she had recorded a voice memo on her phone. "Remember to buy Leo's medicine and the poster board for school." The phone. It must have been nearby, maybe in the study with the door ajar. Had he heard? The idea of being watched, of her life being invaded like that, was more frightening than any scolding. At the end of her shift, as she passed through the service area to get her bag, Beatrice intercepted her in the narrow hallway. The house manager stared at her, her eyes small and hard. "It was a mistake to bring that child here," she said, her voice low and threatening. People who don't know their place end up losing what little they have. Be careful, Lucia. Very careful. The commute home was a blur of city lights and tired faces in the bus window's reflection. Lucia held Leo's hand with a force she didn't realize. The warmth of his small skin contrasting with the cold she felt inside. Beatrice's threat echoed in her mind, repeating like a dark mantra. People who don't know their place. What did that mean? What was her place? The place of someone who cleans up other people's messes and is grateful for it? The memory of Mr. Sterling's smile, however, insisted on overlaying the house manager's venom, creating a dissonance that made her dizzy. They were two sides of the same coin, one gold, one lead, and she was trapped in the middle, not knowing which was real. When they arrived at their simple apartment building, the smell of beans simmering in the hallway wrapped around her like an old friend. It was the smell of home, of safety, of a world where the rules were clear and affection wasn't an anomaly. Elvira, despite her back pain, was sitting in the living room armchair, mending the knee of Leo's school uniform. Her wise, tired eyes met Lucia's and knew, without a word being spoken, that the day had been heavy. While Leo played on the rug with his one-eyed tiger, Lucia told her mother everything, her voice low so the boy wouldn't hear. She spoke of the scene on the swing, the boss's unexpected defense, Beatrice's hostility, and her son's name being spoken by a stranger. Elvira listened in silence, her face wrinkled with worry. Men with a lot of money, my daughter, are like deep rivers. You only see the surface, you never know what's at the bottom, she said finally. All those assets, those multi-million-dollar deals, that changes a person. But it doesn't mean it erases everything good inside them. Maybe that man is just very lonely. The simplicity of those words struck Lucia, but it didn't reassure her. Loneliness was one thing, unpredictability was another, and the latter was far more dangerous. Later, as she tucked Leo into bed, the boy turned to her, his sleepy eyes shining in the dim lamplight. "Mommy," Uncle Goodhart pushed the swing really high. Lucia frowned. "What uncle, honey?" "The big man from the pretty house," he answered, already yawning. The nickname hit her like a punch to the gut. Uncle Goodhart. It was what her grandmother, Elvira's mother, used to call the few good men she had known in her life, those who shared their bread, who helped without expecting anything in return, who had kindness stamped on their souls. It had been years, decades, since she'd heard that expression. How could Leo, a 5-year-old, have resurrected that? And worse, how could he have associated such a pure nickname with a man like Mr. Sterling, a multimillionaire who lived in a world of interest rates, dividends, and stock market investments, a world so far removed from the simplicity of that name? The thought disturbed her all night. The next day, at the mansion, the atmosphere was even heavier. Beatrice barely looked in her direction, communicating through curt gestures and monosyllabic orders. In the days that followed, the mansion became a territory of hostile silences and watchful eyes. Lucia moved through the rooms like a tightrope walker, each step calculated not to disturb the fragile order of things. Beatrice, the house manager, followed her with her eyes, a hawk waiting for the slightest mistake. The presence of Mr. Davies, the lawyer, became more frequent. He would appear without warning, walking the halls with the air of an inspector, checking if doors were locked. If the alarm systems were active, the word security was repeated in hushed conversations with Beatrice, and Lucia knew, without hearing her name, that she and her son were the risk that needed to be contained. The work, once merely tiring, became psychologically exhausting. She scrubbed the floors harder, polished the silverware with more fervor, all to make herself invisible, so that her efficiency would protect her from the suspicion that surrounded her. Mr. Sterling, for his part, had retreated back into his shell of distance. He passed her in the hallways with a formal nod, his eyes focused on some distant point in the universe of his business and immense fortune. The man who had smiled on the swing seemed to have been a mirage, a trick her tired mind had played on her. One Thursday afternoon, while Lucia was cleaning the windows in the dining room, a pearly white luxury car pulled up to the main entrance. A tall, blonde woman stepped out, dressed with an elegance that seemed designed to intimidate. Lucia recognized her from a few discreet photographs she had seen in the house. It was Clarisse, the boss's ex-fiancée. Her arrival instantly changed the dynamics of the house. Beatrice received her with an almost servile reverence, and even Mr. Davies seemed to relax his shoulders in her presence. Clarisse entered the house as if she still owned the place, her nose slightly tilted up, her cold blue eyes assessing every detail. When her gaze landed on Lucia, it was with a disdain that made her feel smaller than she already did. "Beatrice, darling, the dust in these corners is a disgrace," Clarisse said, her voice velvety but with an edge of steel, running a finger over a piece of furniture Lucia had just cleaned. "One must be more rigorous with the hiring, outsourcing help. Without proper references, they tend to get lazy." The humiliation was public, calculated. Lucia felt blood rush to her face, but she kept her head down, clenching the damp cloth in her hands. Later, passing the hallway that led to the study, she noticed something unusual. The heavy oak door, which Mr. Sterling always kept locked, was ajar, a tiny, almost imperceptible crack. A draught of cold air seemed to emanate from it, along with the smell of leather and paper. Her instinct told her to walk away, not to see what was none of her business. But curiosity, mixed with a strange feeling that something was out of place, made her stop. Mr. Sterling wasn't there. She had seen him go out to the garden to take a call. Lucia moved closer, her heart pounding, and peeked through the crack. The room was impeccable, organized, dominated by a large mahogany desk. Books on investments, the stock market and corporate law were stacked with precision. But on the desk, next to a state-of-the-art laptop and a silver pen holder, was something that didn't belong in that scene of power and money. It was a small, discreet silver picture frame, turned slightly to the side. She strained her eyes, trying to make out the image. It wasn't a family photo, nor a landscape. It was a grainy black and white image with rounded shapes and an outline that was vaguely familiar to her. Suddenly, the realization hit her with the force of an icy wave. It was an ultrasound framed and placed in the command center of a billionaire like a secret treasure. Before she could process the shock of the discovery, Clarisse's voice sounded behind her, sharp and accusatory. "What do you think you're doing, snooping on my fiancé?" Lucia's body went cold. Clarisse's voice, though velvety, struck her with the force of a slap. "My fiancé?" The word hung in the air, a declaration of ownership that turned her, Lucia, into an intruder, a threat. She turned slowly, the cleaning cloth still in her hand, now a useless damp rag. Clarisse's face was a mask of polished contempt, her blue eyes flashing. I wasn't snooping, ma'am. The door was open, The excuse died in her throat. Anything she said would sound like a lie, a flimsy excuse from someone caught red-handed. She felt the heat rise up her neck, a wave of humiliation so intense her eyes burned. In that moment, she was the embodiment of the cliché that women like Clarisse so feared and despised, the nosy maid, the subordinate who didn't know her place. Lucia's mind raced, desperate. The image of the ultrasound, so intimate and out of place, now seemed like a trap that had snapped shut on her. Clarisse took a step forward, closing the space between them. Her perfume was expensive and overpowering, an aroma of power. "You think I don't know what people like you do? You keep your eyes on everything, waiting for an opportunity, a slip-up. Arthur's fortune wasn't built on naivete, darling." Just then, the figure of Mr. Sterling appeared at the end of the hall, returning from the garden. His phone was in one hand, His brow furrowed from some business call he had just ended. He stopped upon seeing the scene. Clarisse, tense as a predator, and Lucia, cowering like prey. Clarisse turned to him, her face transforming into an expression of calculated outrage. "Arthur, darling, I'm so glad you're here. I caught this woman snooping in your study. Who knows what she was looking for? Information on your assets, perhaps. Company liabilities. It's an unacceptable security risk." The accusation was grave, delivered with the certainty of someone expecting to be backed up. But Mr. Sterling's reaction was not what she expected. He looked from Clarisse to Lucia, and a deep weariness seemed to settle on his shoulders. He sighed. "The door was open, Clarisse. It was my oversight. Lucia did nothing wrong." His voice was quiet, devoid of emotion, but carried a finality that completely disarmed Clarisse. He then looked her directly in the eye. "And we've talked about this. We are no longer engaged." The blow was double and precise. The public correction of Clarisse's status hurt more than any shout. The ex-fiancée turned pale, her lips pressing into a thin line of silent fury. Mr. Sterling turned to Lucia, his gaze unreadable. "You can go back to your work," he said, in the same neutral tone as before. Then he entered the study and closed the door behind him. The click of the lock echoing in the tense hallway. Lucia felt her legs weaken. She wanted to run, to disappear. She mumbled an almost inaudible "excuse me" and hurried away, feeling Clarisse's eyes burning into her back. The rest of the afternoon was torment. Lucia cleaned and scrubbed, but her mind was elsewhere, replaying the scene, feeling the weight of that hostility. Her boss's defense didn't relieve her. On the contrary, it put her in an even more dangerous position. She was no longer invisible. She was the housekeeper the billionaire defended against his ex-fiancée. She was a pawn who, unintentionally, had moved forward on the board of a game she didn't understand. Near the end of her shift, when she went to the pantry for a glass of water, she heard voices coming from the kitchen. It was Clarisse and Beatrice. Lucia froze, her heart leaping. Clarisse's voice was a venomous whisper filled with cold anger. "She's not just a housekeeper, Beatrice. Did you see the way he defended her? It's obvious what's happening. She's worming her way in, trying to trap him. Thinks a baby in her arms will guarantee her a piece of this inheritance. But I will put an end to this. I'm going to show everyone, starting with the Homeowners Association, what kind of woman she really is." Clarisse's poisonous promise materialized faster than Lucia could have imagined. The next morning, when she arrived for work, she found a visibly altered environment. Small acrylic signs reading "Restricted Access" had been affixed to the doors of the study, the library, and the bedroom wing. They were new, shiny, a cold, physical demarcation of her place. Beatrice greeted her with a printed schedule, detailing her hours and the exact areas she could clean with timed breaks. It was a silent humiliation, a way of saying that her every move would be monitored. Mr. Davies, the lawyer, was present, overseeing the implementation of the new security guidelines, as he called them. He gave her a stern, professional look. "Lucia, as of today, your activities will be strictly limited to the service and social areas of the first floor. Any deviation from protocol will be considered a breach of contract." There was no direct accusation, but the message was crystal clear. She was a potential threat, a risk to be managed like any other liability in her boss's business. She felt a knot form in her throat, a mixture of anger and helplessness. She wanted to scream that she was an honest woman, that she had never coveted what wasn't hers, that the only treasure that mattered to her was sleeping, hugging a stuffed tiger. But what good would it do? Her word against a billionaire's ex-fiancé was worthless. The days dragged on under this new atmosphere of oppression. Mr. Sterling seemed oblivious to it all, engrossed in phone calls and meetings. If he had noticed the signs and the new surveillance regime, he gave no indication. His distance was a wall of ice. Lucia worked in silence, her head down, feeling more and more like a prisoner in a gilded cage. Fear for her job mingled with a growing anxiety for Leo's safety. What if Clarice followed through on her threats? What if she tried something against her son? The thought was so terrifying it kept her up at night. On a Friday, the blow came. Lucia was finishing her shift when the intercom from the front gate buzzed in the kitchen. Beatrice answered, and after a few seconds, turned to her with a triumphant, cruel smile. "It's for you, Lucia, from Child Protective Services." Lucia's world collapsed. Her legs gave out and she had to lean on the cold marble countertop. "CPS? Why?" The voice on the other end of the line was formal and impersonal. An anonymous complaint had been filed, alleging that she exposed her son to inappropriate and potentially dangerous work environments. The accusation was absurd, a cruel distortion of reality. But the official machinery was already in motion. A visit from a social worker was scheduled for the following week. At her home, Lucia hung up the phone, trembling, cold sweat beading on her forehead. It was Clarice. It had to be. It was her revenge, a dirty, low blow aimed at her most vulnerable point, her motherhood. The idea of someone questioning her love and care for Leo, of having to prove she was a good mother to a stranger, was the worst of humiliations. She felt hot tears of panic and anger welling in her eyes. She needed to get out of there, to breathe. She staggered outside toward the small service area in the back where she kept her belongings. As she passed through the garden, the late afternoon sun blinded her for a moment, and then she saw Clarice was there, in the center of the lawn, directing a team of event planners. They were setting up a small stage, arranging tables with white linens. Clarice turned, and her eyes met Lucia's. There was a glint of victory in her gaze. "We're organizing a little charity event for the orphanage I sponsor," she said, her voice loud enough for Lucia to hear. "Lovely children, all needing a home. Arthur has always been so generous with my causes. It's important to show the world the human side of those who have so much, don't you think?" It was a performance, a show of power. She was positioning herself as the perfect woman for the wealthy man, the charitable lady, while painting Lucia as the negligent mother. In that moment, Lucia felt utterly defeated, an ant under Clarice's high-heeled boot. The Saturday of the charity event dawned with a clear blue sky, a cruel contrast to the storm brewing inside Lucia. She had to work that weekend. Beatrice had made a point of calling her in, claiming the need for extra cleaning staff. The real reason, Lucia knew, was different. It was to force her to watch Clarice's triumph, to rub salt in her open wound. The garden, once a quiet refuge, was transformed. Colorful balloons floated in the air, soft music played from discreet speakers, and well-dressed children from the orphanage, sponsored by Clarice, ran across the lawn, their laughter filling the space. It was a scene of manufactured happiness, a spectacle of charity for the society photographers who milled about. Lucia worked behind the scenes, cleaning glasses, collecting napkins, her heart as heavy as a stone. Every smile Clarice gave the cameras, every gesture of false modesty, was a stab. She saw Mr. Sterling circulate among the guests, his face serious, his posture impeccable, playing his role as the wealthy and generous host. He seemed distant, as if acting on a stage that wasn't his own. Lucia had to bring Leo with her again. Elvira still hadn't recovered, and after the CPS complaint, she didn't dare leave him with anyone else. She hid him in the laundry room, a hot, noisy space at the back of the house, with the promise that it would be quick. She gave him her phone so he could play a quiet game, her heart tight with guilt and fear. The whole time, the image of the social worker who would visit her in a few days haunted her thoughts. What would she say? How would she prove the complaint was a lie? The paranoia consumed her. In a moment of distraction, while Lucia was carrying a tray of dirty glasses to the kitchen, Leo slipped out. The noise of the party, the laughter of the other children, was an irresistible magnet. When Lucia realized, her blood ran cold. She searched for him desperately, panic rising in her throat, and then she saw him. He was near the swing, staring with wide, wondrous eyes at the other children. Before she could reach him, Mr. Sterling saw him too. He excused himself from the guest he was talking to and walked toward the boy. Lucia held her breath, waiting for the scolding, the cold order for her to control her son. But what happened next left her paralyzed. Mr. Sterling crouched down next to Leo, ignoring the curious glances from those around them. He said nothing for a moment, just watched the boy. Then he took something from his jacket pocket. It was a small, dark wooden box, delicately carved. With a gentle movement, he opened it. A soft, melancholy melody began to play, floating on the party air. It was "Someone to Watch Over Me," the Gershwin classic, in a delicate, old-fashioned arrangement. Leo's eyes widened, mesmerized by the sound and the tiny ballerina spinning inside the box. "I brought this back from a trip many years ago," Mr. Sterling said, his voice low, almost a whisper, meant only for the boy. "I never found the right person to give it to. I think it was waiting for you." He placed the music box in Leo's small hands. At that moment, time stood still. The party music, the conversations, the clicks of the cameras, it all faded away. There was only the sound of "Someone to Watch Over Me," the melody filling the yard, and somehow Lucia's heart. The gesture was so pure, so unexpected, that it broke through the shell of fear and anger that had encased her. A single tear ran down her face. The scene did not go unnoticed. Clarice, watching from a distance, saw her spectacles stolen by that moment of genuine connection, her face contorted into a mask of fury. That gesture from the man she was trying to win back, directed at the housekeeper's son, was an unbearable affront. The truce was short-lived. Days later, looking for an excuse to keep her working late, Beatrice sent her to organize a storage room upstairs, an area that was now forbidden to her. Lucia obeyed, anxious not to cause more trouble. It was when she entered one of the guest rooms down the hall that her world turned upside down for a second time. The room wasn't for guests. It was impeccably arranged as a child's nursery. New furniture, a soft rug, toys carefully placed on shelves, and on the pale blue wall, above the crib, painted in delicate, unmistakable white letters, was a name. The shock pierced her like an icy wind, stealing her breath and the strength from her legs. The name painted on the wall was Leo. The air in the room seemed to thin, too heavy to breathe. Lucia took a step back, her hand covering her mouth to stifle the scream that rose in her throat. Leo, her son's name, painted in perfect script on the wall of a secret room, inside that cold, impersonal mansion. The initial shock gave way to a whirlwind of terrifying questions. How? Why? The gesture with the music box, which for a brief moment had made her believe in a spark of goodness, now transformed into something sinister, part of a plan she couldn't comprehend. She felt watched, studied, as if her life and her son's were pieces on a board, manipulated by powerful, invisible hands. That room wasn't an act of kindness. It was an appropriation, an invasion of her most precious treasure. The man who amassed an incalculable fortune, who dealt with the coldness of numbers and stocks, seemed to want to buy what was priceless, her son. The idea was so monstrous, so absurd, that it made her nauseous. She left the room blindly, her heart hammering against her ribs, and nearly ran down the stairs. She had to get out of there. She had to protect Leo from this sick obsession. When she reached the service area to get her things, she ran into Beatrice. The house manager looked at her with her small, sharp eyes, noticing her pallor and agitation. A minimal, almost imperceptible smile curved her lips. She knew, Beatrice knew about the room and had sent her there on purpose, so she would see, so the fear would consume her. The game Clarice, Beatrice, and perhaps Mr. Sterling himself were playing was becoming clear. They wanted to destabilize her, to drive her mad, so the CPS complaint would seem plausible. They wanted to paint her as an unstable, unfit mother. The final blow came the next day. Lucia arrived at work with her decision made. She would quit at the end of the day. She would endure the last few hours, get her pay, and disappear from these people's lives. But they were faster. Upon entering the kitchen, she found Mr. Davies, the lawyer, and Beatrice waiting for her. Their expressions were grave and official. "Lucia, we need to have a conversation," the lawyer said, his formal tone cutting through the air. He gestured toward the dining room, where Mr. Sterling was already seated at the head of the table, his face a mask of impenetrable seriousness. Clarice was by his side, her posture that of a loyal, concerned advisor. "There has been an incident," Mr. Davies began, opening a folder on the polished table. "Last night, Mr. Sterling noticed that some important documents were missing from his personal safe in the study." Lucia felt the floor vanish from beneath her feet. Safe? Documents? She barely ever entered that study. They are papers related to a new investment, confidential information about the company's capital movements, the lawyer continued, staring at her intently. The loss of these assets could result in a deficit of millions of dollars. It was then that Beatrice interjected, her voice filled with false hesitation. I didn't want to say anything, Mr. Davies, but yesterday, late in the afternoon, when I went upstairs to check the rooms, I saw Lucia near the study door. She seemed nervous. The lie was brazen, cruel, a perfectly constructed trap. Lucia opened her mouth to protest, to scream that it was a lie, that Beatrice had sent her upstairs. But the words wouldn't come. The shock paralyzed her. Mr. Davies closed the folder with a sharp, final sound. "To protect my client's image and assets, and to avoid a larger scandal, a decision has been made. Your contract is being terminated for cause, effective immediately." Humiliation. It was the only word left. Mr. Sterling remained silent, his gaze fixed on a point on the wall, avoiding hers. He didn't defend her. The man who had given her the music box now condemned her with his silence. Lucia was dismissed through the back door, with no severance, no rights. As she walked away, the tears finally came, hot and bitter. She hugged her son, who was waiting for her with his grandmother at the service gate, as if the whole world wanted to steal him from her. Looking back, she saw the gardener, a quiet man named Angelo, watching her with compassion. He had lent her the key to the wheelbarrow days before so she could move some heavy pots. Now, that same side gate, opened with a borrowed key, was her escape route, the symbol of her expulsion. The sound of the swing creaking in the wind, empty, echoed behind her like a melancholy farewell, closing the loop on a week that had destroyed her fragile world. The second week began with the familiar smell of bleach and the weight of an inescapable reality. The unjust firing forced her back to square one. The savings she had painstakingly set aside for an emergency began to slip through her fingers like fine sand. Rent, electricity, food. The bills didn't wait for justice to be served. Lucia went back to doing odd cleaning jobs in smaller apartments in the neighborhood, work that paid little and was exhausting. With every bucket of dirty water she emptied, the image of the mansion's luxury and cruelty haunted her. They were such different worlds, governed by such different laws. In her world, honesty was a pillar. In theirs, it seemed to be just a disposable variable in the equation of profit and power. The visit from the social worker, a woman with tired but kind eyes named Sonia, took place on a rainy Tuesday. Lucia had cleaned her small apartment until it shone, trying to compensate for the lack of wealth with an excess of care. Sonia observed everything: the stocked refrigerator, the children's book stacked in a corner, the way Leo ran into his mother's arms. She asked questions about their routine, about the boy's health, about Lucia's support network. Lucia answered everything with a sincerity that bordered on pain, omitting only the sordid details of her dismissal, afraid the truth would sound like a paranoid delusion. Sonia seemed satisfied, but explained that, per protocol, she would need to make a second visit. The threat still hung in the air. As if that weren't enough, Leo got sick. A bad cold, with a high fever and a persistent cough that left him listless and tearful. The night was a nightmare. Without money for a space heater, Lucia sat on a plastic chair beside his bed, changing the cool washcloth on his forehead every half hour, her body aching with exhaustion, her heart tight with worry. Sleep overtook her in fits and starts, and she woke with a stiff neck, the first light of morning revealing the deep circles under her eyes in the mirror. That same day, a plain white envelope was slipped under her door. Inside, a significant amount of cash. Lucia knew immediately where it came from. It was Clarisse's money, the staged gesture for the charity event cameras, the handout from the benevolent lady to the poor housekeeper. The money burned in her hands. It was the price of her humiliation, the payment for her silence. With a fury she didn't know she possessed, she crumpled the bills and threw them in the trash. She would rather starve than touch that dirty money, that charity that was, in fact, a weapon. Feeling cornered, she sought help at the local parish, a place that had always been a safe harbor for the community. There, she found unexpected support. The community daycare, run by kind-hearted nuns, opened up a temporary spot for Leo, allowing her to work with more peace of mind. It was at the daycare that she met Miguel, the volunteer music teacher, a young man with an easy smile and an attentive gaze who played guitar for the children. He immediately noticed Leo's fixation on the music box Mr. Sterling had given him. The boy carried it everywhere, asking for the melody of "Someone to Watch Over Me" to play on a loop. Miguel, sensing the object's importance, gave Leo a small seed shaker. "So you can play along, champ," he said. The boy was enchanted with the new toy, the soft sound of the seeds becoming the soundtrack to his days. As she watched her son, happy with that simple gesture, Lucia found herself thinking, had she interpreted everything wrong? Could the man who had given her son such a meaningful gift, who had smiled on the swing, be the same monster who painted Leo's name on a wall and accused her of theft? The doubt gnawed at her, leaving her adrift, but another blow struck, pulling her from her reflections. An official letter arrived from the luxury-gated community. Mr. Davies, acting on behalf of the Homeowners Association, had initiated a security audit, citing the recent breach of rules. The consequence, the letter stated, could be the permanent blacklisting of her name from the list of service providers for the entire community. It was a professional death sentence. They weren't satisfied with firing her. They wanted to ensure she never set foot there again, never had the chance to get back on her feet. The letter from the Homeowners Association was the last straw, the final push into an abyss of despair. The ban wouldn't just affect her future, it would tarnish her name, her reputation. For a woman whose only net worth was her own honesty, the threat was devastating. Lucia sat at her kitchen table, the letter crumpled in her hand, and cried. She cried for the injustice, for the helplessness, for the cruelty of a world that seemed determined to crush her. Elvira hugged her, her frail arms offering the only comfort Lucia knew. "We can't give up, my daughter. The truth is, like water, it always finds a way." Her mother's words, though spoken with a trembling voice, ignited a tiny spark in the darkness. Giving up was not an option. She had to fight, not just for herself, but for Leo. She had to prove she wasn't the person they had painted her to be. But how? She had no money for a lawyer, no proof, nothing but her word. Hope seemed like a distant, unreachable star, nearly extinguished. It was then that a memory surfaced, faint and uncertain. Angelo, the gardener, the compassionate look he had given her on the day she was fired. He was a quiet man, almost invisible, but he was always there, pruning the roses, sweeping the leaves, observing everything in silence. Maybe he had seen something. With her heart pounding, Lucia went to the community late that afternoon, around the time she knew Angelo finished his shift. She waited outside, at the bus stop, feeling like a criminal returning to the scene of the crime. When he appeared, his tired face creased by the sun, she approached him hesitantly. She explained the situation, the accusation of theft, the study door that Beatrice swore she had been lurking around. Angelo's eyes narrowed. He looked around, as if afraid of being seen, and pulled her to a more discreet corner. "I don't like gossip, Mom, but I don't like injustice either," he said, his voice low and raspy. "That day, earlier, I was trimming the grass near the library. I saw Mrs. Beatrice messing with the lock on the study door. She used a master key. I thought it was strange, because Mr. Sterling never lets anyone in there." The gardener then reached into the pocket of his worn-out pants and pulled out a piece of a paper bag, crumpled and stained with dirt. He unfolded it and showed it to her. There was a note in pencil. 3:45 p.m. HK. "Office. I write things down so I don't forget," he explained, almost apologetically. "I'm scared of losing my job, Mom. I've got a family to support. But what's right is right." Lucia looked at that crumpled piece of paper as if it were the most valuable thing in the world. It was a piece, small, fragile, but it was the first piece of a puzzle that could save her life. She thanked Angelo with tears in her eyes, her gratitude so immense she could barely speak. His gesture, an act of courage from a man with so much to lose, renewed her strength. That night, she couldn't sleep. Angelo's information lit a fire in her mind. The ajar door, Clarice's accusation, Beatrice's lie. It all started to connect. Driven by a desperate intuition, she took out her old phone and began to sift through the voice memos she recorded for herself. It was a habit she had for remembering daily tasks, shopping lists, messages. There were dozens of short, unimportant audio files. She listened to them one by one, patiently, going back to the days before her dismissal, and then she found it. An audio file recorded on the morning of the charity event. Her own voice said, "Remember to buy more disinfectant and furniture polish." But in the background, very faint, almost inaudible, was another sound. A fragment of conversation from a nearby room. She turned the volume to maximum, pressing the phone to her ear, and there it was. Beatrice's voice, muffled by distance but unmistakable, telling the kitchen staff, "Leave the study door open. The event needs candid shots of Mr. Sterling working." Lucia's breath caught in her throat. There it was, the thread that connected everything. The door wasn't an oversight, it was a setup, and she had the proof. The third week began with a grey sky and a cold wind that promised rain, a perfect reflection of Lucia's state of mind. But now, anxiety was mixed with a new, fierce determination. She had the recording and the gardener's note. They were her only weapons, fragile against the wall of money and power she would face, but they were weapons forged in truth. She was no longer alone. She sought the help of Sonia, the social worker from CPS, and Sister Matilda, the nun who ran the parish daycare. In a small room at the back of the church, with the scent of candles and old books in the air, Lucia laid everything out. She showed them Angelo's note, played the audio recording, and, with a choked voice, told them about the room with Leo's name on the wall. Sonia and Sister Matilda listened in silence, their faces growing more and more serious. The story, which could have sounded like a delusion, took on the shape of a cruel conspiracy as the evidence fell into place. They believed her. The validation from these two respected women in the community was like a balm. Sonia, with her experience in handling complex disputes, suggested the safest approach: schedule an official meeting at the CPS office. There, the environment is neutral. The rules are clear. No one can use their power to shout louder. Everyone will have to speak and listen, she explained. The summons was sent. Mr. Sterling was called to appear as part of the investigation into the complaint against Lucia. The meeting was set for a Wednesday. The day arrived thick with an almost electric tension. Lucia's stomach churned. She wore her best clothes, a simple but clean and ironed dress, and tied her hair in a firm bun. Leo, sensing his mother's anxiety, clung to her hand and wouldn't let go, rhythmically shaking his seed shaker, a sound that strangely calmed her nerves. Miguel, the music teacher, offered to accompany them, a silent and comforting support. They arrived at the CPS office, a simple government building with peeling paint and the smell of strong coffee. The meeting room was small, with an oval table in the center. Mr. Sterling arrived punctually, stern and impenetrable, accompanied by Mr. Davies and Clarice, who wore an expression of boredom, as if the whole situation were a bourgeois inconvenience. The businessman sat in the chair opposite Lucia, avoiding her gaze. The meeting began with Sonia explaining the purpose of the gathering in a procedural manner. The atmosphere was heavy, broken only by the soft sound of Leo's shaker. Sonia turned to the boy with a gentle smile. "Leo, did you like visiting the big house where your mom used to work?" The boy, who had been withdrawn until then, nodded. "And what did you like best about it?" she asked. Leo thought for a moment, the shaker stopping in his hand. He looked at Mr. Sterling without fear and said with the clarity of a child, "The music from the room." The silence that followed in the room was absolute. 4 simple words that dismantled Mr. Sterling's armor. The mention of the room, of the music, hit him in a way no formal accusation ever could. His shoulders, once straight and tense, slumped. The mask of indifference shattered, revealing a deep, old pain. He raised his eyes and, for the first time, looked directly at Lucia, and she saw in them not the arrogance of the boss, but the vulnerability of a broken man. He raised a hand, stopping Sonia, who was about to speak. I need to explain," he said, his voice hoarse, fragile, and the truth he revealed was a cut without blood, an invisible wound that had been bleeding for years. "Years ago, I lost my wife. She was pregnant. We lost our baby. A boy." The air left Lucia's lungs, the ultrasound on the desk, the room, the music box. It all clicked into place in a terribly sad way. "The room you saw," he continued, his voice thick with emotion, "was a shrine of grief, a place that I, in secret, had been renovating, trying to accept the loss, and the name on the wall. It's the name of the local parish, Lucia, St. Leo's. I had it painted for a donation project for a daycare there, a project I postponed at the last minute. It wasn't for your son." Mr. Sterling's confession hung in the room, dense and heavy, completely changing the atmosphere. The revelation of his personal tragedy didn't erase the injustice Lucia had suffered, but it recontextualized it, transforming what seemed like a sinister obsession into an act of deep, clumsy grief. Lucia looked at him, and for the first time, she saw not the arrogant billionaire, but a man haunted by a pain that she, as a mother, could vaguely begin to understand. The silence in the room was broken not by compassion, but by anger. Clarice, seeing her position of control disintegrate, stood up abruptly, her face red with fury. "This is ridiculous. It's obvious she's using this tragic story to take advantage of you, to get ahead in life. Arthur, don't be so naive." The accusation was so cruel and out of place that it shocked everyone, including Mr. Davies. The ever-pragmatic lawyer tried to regain control, regardless of personal matters, for the sake of prudence and the security of my client's assets. The ban on Lucia's access to the community must be maintained. The theft accusation, while circumstantial, is still serious. His coldness gave Lucia her strength back. Her pain was legitimate, as was his, but the injustice had to be undone. With a trembling hand but a firm voice, she took out her phone. "I didn't steal anything, but I know who set this all up." She placed the device on the table and pressed play. The recording, muffled but clear, filled the room. Beatrice's voice, ordering the study door to be left open, echoed, irrefutable. Then she placed Angelo's note next to the phone. Mr. Davies went pale. Clarice was speechless, her mouth agape in a shocked, "Oh!" Mr. Sterling closed his eyes, as if the weight of the revelation were physical. Sonia, the social worker, acted quickly. In light of this new evidence, CPS will request a site visit to the mansion to verify these claims. The visit happened the next day. The mood in the house was funereal. Mr. Sterling met them at the door, his face gaunt. Beatrice was present, her arrogant posture now replaced by a poorly concealed nervousness. Sonia requested access to the security camera footage. Mr. Davies intervened, stating that the main cameras didn't cover the internal hallways. It was Clarice who, in a lapse of vanity, betrayed herself. The cameras from the event, they were installed everywhere to capture candid moments with the donors. I supervised it myself. At Sonia's request, the recordings were accessed, and there it was. A camera positioned at the end of the hallway clearly showed Beatrice, hours before Lucia went upstairs, entering the study and subtly moving a picture frame on the shelf. There was no theft of documents, just the creation of minimal disorder to justify an accusation. The truth, recorded in high definition, came crashing down on them all. Mr. Sterling looked at Beatrice, the disappointment in his face more cutting than any scream. "Pack your things. Get out of my house. Now." Then he turned to Lucia, his eyes filled with a profound regret. "Lucia, forgive me. There are no words to describe how wrong I was. Please accept your job back." The room fell silent, everyone waiting for Lucia's answer. The relief of having her innocence proven was immense, but something inside her had changed. Go back to that place of pain, of suspicion, back to being the invisible housekeeper at the mercy of the moods of a rich, tormented man. She looked at her son, who was watching her with his big, trusting eyes, and she knew she couldn't, not in the same way. "I appreciate the offer, sir, but I can't accept," she said, her voice calm but unwavering. "Not like that." Mr. Davies and Clarice looked at her as if she were insane to refuse such an offer. But Lucia continued, her chin held high. "If I come back, it will be with a formal contract, with benefits, and with a clause guaranteeing my son the right to a quality daycare paid for by you, so he never has to be snuck into my workplace again." She paused, looking directly at Mr. Sterling. "And one more thing. An image protection clause, so that Leo will never, under any circumstances, be used in your company's events or photographed to promote your business. My son is not an asset to improve your reputation." The demands were audacious, almost unthinkable for someone in her position. They were a test. For the lawyer, they were insurmountable obstacles. For Clarice, a ridiculous absurdity. For Mr. Sterling, they were the price of his redemption. The moment of greatest tension wasn't the accusation, but this, the moment of choice, where money and power faced a mother's dignity and love. Lucia's demands hung in the air, redefining the boundaries of power in that room. Mr. Davies scoffed, adjusting his glasses. "This is atypical. A contract with these specifics would require complex legal analysis. The tax implications, the labor liabilities." Clarice let out a derisive laugh. "Legal analysis. She's asking for the moon. Daycare, an image clause. It's the height of opportunism." But Mr. Sterling wasn't looking at either of them. His eyes were fixed on Lucia, and in them she saw a flicker of admiration. He, a man accustomed to negotiating with corporate sharks, to bending wills with the weight of his fortune, was being confronted by a force he couldn't buy, a mother's integrity. He raised a hand, silencing his lawyer and his ex-fiancée. "It will be done," he said, his voice firm, without hesitation. "Everything she asked for, draft the contract, Davies. The defeat on Clarice's face was plain to see. She had lost the final battle, not to a rival from her social circle, but to the housekeeper she had so thoroughly humiliated. She stood up, her mask of sophistication cracking. "You've lost your mind, Arthur," she hissed, before turning and walking out of the room and out of his life with the rigidity of an ice sculpture. In the days that followed, the mansion underwent a quiet but profound transformation. Mr. Sterling, for the first time in years, confronted the grief he had locked away. With the help of a therapist he began seeing, he opened the nursery shrine. In a symbolic and painful gesture, he himself washed the walls, painting them a neutral white, erasing the name of the saint that, in his pain, had nearly desecrated the identity of Lucia's son. The crib and children's furniture were donated to the parish daycare. The only thing that remained was the small shelf where now he placed the music box. One day, passing through the hall, he wound it up. The sound of someone to watch over me filled the space, no longer with the weight of mourning, but with the lightness of a new possibility. The house began to change. The garden, once impeccable and cold, came to life. The crab apples that fell and were promptly swept away by Angelo were now collected. The new house manager, a woman with an easy smile, turned them into jelly in the kitchen, the sweet smell spreading through the house. The swing, the symbol of where it all began, had its old, creaky chains replaced with new ones, silent and colorful. Mr. Sterling changed too. He began to delegate more of his business decisions, freeing up his schedule. He started visiting the parish daycare, not as a distant benefactor signing a check, but as a volunteer. He helped serve snacks, read stories to the children. It was there he reconnected with Miguel, the music teacher, and discovered a genuine interest in the young man's work. Lucia, meanwhile, used that time to strengthen herself. The second visit from Sonia, the social worker, was a mere formality. The anonymous complaint case was closed, with an official apology from CPS for the disturbance. Lucia felt a huge weight lift from her shoulders. She had won. She had not only proven her innocence, but had secured a safer future for her son, all without sacrificing her dignity. The contract was ready. Mr. Davies presented it to her with formal reluctance. Everything was there. The position as housekeeping supervisor, a decent salary, compatible hours, and highlighted the clauses about the daycare and Leo's image protection. The resolution of the conflicts wasn't magical. It was bureaucratic, real. The signing of the contract, however, was delayed by an act of nature. Near the end of the third week, a biblical storm descended on the city. The heavy rain and howling wind knocked out the power in Lucia's neighborhood. The world plunged into sudden darkness. Leo, who was terrified of the dark, panicked. He began to cry, a frightened wail that broke Lucia's heart. The few candles she had barely illuminated the small apartment, and the sound of the storm outside seemed like the roar of a monster. She held him, trying to calm him, but her own fear mixed with his. That's when they heard a knock at the door. Loud, urgent. Lucia froze. Who could it be on a night like this? With her heart in her throat, she opened it a crack. The beam of a flashlight blinded her for a second. The person outside was soaked, clothes clinging to their body, hair dripping. When Lucia's vision adjusted, her jaw dropped. It was Mr. Sterling. Not the billionaire in his luxury car, but a man who had braved the flooded streets and arrived there on foot, carrying flashlights and blankets. He looked at her, vulnerability exposed on his face. "The street's flooded. The cars can't get through," he said, his voice breathless. "I figured you might be scared. I don't want to leave again. Give me one last chance to prove I can be here for you." Arthur's presence, soaked and breathless at her apartment door, was the most unexpected twist of all. He hadn't come with the arrogance of money, which solves everything with a phone call, but with the humility of someone who had faced the storm. the crowded bus, and the flooded street, driven by genuine concern. Leo, upon seeing the bright flashlight beams and the familiar face of Uncle Goodhart, stopped crying. That gesture, so simple and so significant, broke down Lucia's last wall of distrust. She let him in. That night, by the light of candles and flashlights, they didn't talk about contracts or business. They talked about fears. Leo talked about the rain monster, and Arthur, with a patience Lucia would have never imagined, told him a story about a gentle giant who controlled the thunder. Lucia talked about the fear of not being able to pay the rent, and Arthur talked about the fear of loneliness, of the silence echoing in his empty mansion. In that small living room, wealth and poverty dissolved, leaving only three human beings, vulnerable to the storm outside and the storms within. He didn't offer money, but something more valuable, his presence. Before he left, when the rain had subsided to a fine drizzle, he made his final proposal. "I want to file a formal sponsorship for Leo. Not to take your place, Lucia, but to be a real, legal support in his life. Daycare, school, health insurance, all documented at the notary in your neighborhood. So you have the security of knowing it's not just an empty promise." The cost of that victory was real. To accept, Lucia would have to let go of part of her pride, of the armor she had built to handle everything alone. She would have to learn to trust without submitting, to accept help without feeling diminished. She cried, a silent, liberating cry, remembering all the times she needed help and received only closed doors. And through the tears, she accepted. The signing of the sponsorship and the employment contract took place days later in a small, noisy notary public's office in her neighborhood. No photographers, no glamour. Trembling hands holding simple pens. The smell of paper and hand sanitizer in the air. It was a real ending, without fireworks, built on the ashes of great pain. Lucia returned to the mansion, but not as the invisible housekeeper. She returned as Lucia, the team supervisor, with a voice, rights, and respect. Her first act was to establish a new rule, readily accepted by Arthur. On Saturday afternoons, the garden gate would be opened, and the swing, now silent and colorful, would be available for all the children from the daycare's neighborhood. It was her mark on the new universe being born there. The epilogue to this journey was no fairy tale. The ex-fiancée, Clarice, vanished from the social scene, her reputation tarnished by greed. Mr. Davies continued as the company lawyer, his audacity now tempered by a prudence born of experience. Beatrice was never seen again, but for those who chose the path of kindness, life flourished. Angelo, the gardener, was promoted to grounds manager with a pay raise. Miguel, the music teacher, received a sponsorship from Arthur to expand the music program at the daycare. At the first welcome barbecue in the mansion's garden, the scene was a portrait of that new family, improbable and real. Lucia and Arthur chatted near the grill, while Elvira, her back now recovered, taught the new house manager how to make her famous potato salad. Angelo and his wife laughed with Sonia, the social worker, and at the center of it all, Leo shook his seed shaker, accompanying the melody of "Someone to Watch Over Me" that came from the old music box, now being played by Miguel on his guitar. The sound filled the yard, a lullaby for all the sorrows that had been left behind. At the end of the afternoon, Leo, tired from playing, ran to Lucia and Arthur, who were standing side by side, watching the scene. He took a hand from each of them and, resting his head on his mother's lap, pointed to them both and whispered shyly, "My family." In that instant, it was impossible not to remember the swing that once creaked, the fear, the injustice, and the humiliation. But it was the memory of an unexpected gesture from a sad man that had started it all, proving that sometimes the first scream isn't of pain, but of a shock that awakens life to a new beginning.